All right, so greetings. We're live now. Good. All right, greetings and happy Friday. All right, so yes, welcome to this Friday night live stream. We're starting at 7:30 instead of 7. I'll wait a little bit just because I know sometimes, once again, Facebook sometimes takes a little bit before they'll notify people that that we're live. But yes, so welcome to those that are here, and yeah, thanks for joining me. Sorry about the little time change. If just for those that might come in a little bit later, if you haven't seen my posts, I am actually going to be doing my Friday night live streams for the foreseeable future at 7:30 instead. I'm also waiting for my tea to steep. So yeah, so I'll be doing them at 7:30 for the foreseeable future. Simply because there was a slight change in my schedule. Some of you probably know I'm also a fitness trainer, and since a lot of places are going in the green, that means like a lot of places like gyms, hair salons, and the like are now opening. Things that would have been complete, like absolute no-nos before in a red or a yellow type setting. But yeah, so gym's now open, and my training schedule now, it's a little bit different than it was before. So yeah, so now we're doing these at 7:30 instead of 7 o'clock, at least for the foreseeable future. So yeah, so but definitely thank you for tuning in. And like I said, tonight I am going to be having tea with you and spilling some tea on some history myths, okay? But before I do, just a quick shout out to April C. Thomas of Fashions Revisited, and I'm actually wearing her shirt that says keep calm and wear your stays. Guys, a lot of you know I actually am a little bit of an advocate for corsets and stays, at least to the point to where I, like many people, are kind of tired of all the myths and, you know, just stuff that goes around about them. Hence why I am also busting some history myths. But she has a wonderful shop if you're into period clothing. She was doing 18th century for a while, still does, but she's also branching out into other eras, including starting to sell some vintage clothing. So, you know, straight up vintage clothing, not necessarily clothing that, you know, that she made, that, you know, based off of patterns from the olden days. But yeah, but definitely look her up, and I will leave a link in the description below. So all right, so that also brings us to why we're here, and we're gonna be debunking a few history myths, 2 to be exact. And 2 of these are also some of my pet peeves. But yeah, so we'll be doing that here, and then I'll be talking to you a little bit of what to expect on my podcast, and then last but not least, we're gonna give you a quick music update. So yeah, so I think my tea might be steeped. Let me see. Oh yeah. And the kind of tea I'm having, it's Twinings. It's raspberry and pomegranate. It's very good. So yeah, so I'm gonna pour the tea, and then we will get into spilling some. All right. By the way, yes, I do drink my tea just straight up. I don't put any cream, sugar, or anything like that. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of honey in there. Just, you know, like say like before singing. I actually do have a very specific kind of tea that I drink right before singing. I'll put a little bit of honey in there with that. But normally, as far as just my regular tea drinking that goes, I just drink it straight. So, and same thing with coffee too. I drink a lot of my coffee just like almost black pretty much. I might put like a tiny bit of like a little creamer in it or something like that, just for some light flavor. But other than that, I drink my tea and my coffee just straight plain. And some people have looked at that and they're like, you just, ew, gross, how can you drink that? But that's what I do. So, all right, so on to why we're here. And yeah, if you're just joining us, I'm gonna be discussing 2 history myths, okay? And then also a little bit of what's coming up on my podcast, and also giving you a little music update. So, all right, here we go. So as far as history myths go, there's times I just kind of look at them and I'm like, why? You know, like, why are these even a thing? You know, why do people even believe this? But, you know, people do. And in a way I can kind of understand, because to many, the past is a pretty foreign place, especially the distant past, you know, when we're talking maybe like 100 years or more into the past. And, you know, so I can kind of understand why people, you know, might believe, you know, maybe some of the more odd things that that go around. And when I say debunking history myths, because anytime somebody does that, anytime somebody you know, does something like, say, you know, just do like a, you know, like a blog debunking some popular and thought to be true history myths, you know, or, you know, a lot of, there's one particular blog out there called History Myths Debunked, and actually the woman who runs that blog, Mary Miley Theobald, she has a really good book out there called Death by Petticoat, American History Myths Debunked. And it's a very fast, easy read. I do have the book. It's not on the shelf that I thought it was on, so it's probably somewhere among my other books. But yeah, but it is a good book. It's a fast, easy read. If you're, you know, and I wouldn't say, it doesn't necessarily get into like the underlayers of the history myths that that she addresses. But I always tell people it's a great start when you're starting to just kind of scratch at the surface. And one thing that I always tell people, especially, you know, the message that I try to get out there when I'm talking history is always question everything. And you kind of have to be open to the fact that you might be wrong. And, you know, and that's the thing. And it's usually, at least, and this has just been my experience, the more well-learned a person is, the more they seem open to the idea that, yeah, there might be more to what's behind the curtain, so to speak, or what's behind a certain little factoid, or, you know, if you will. There might be more to that, or hey, you might be straight up wrong. And like I said, this isn't all the time, but this has just been my experience. And it's usually been the people who aren't necessarily, you know, I hate to say that, well-learned, but, you know, but they don't necessarily take the time to do the research, I guess, if you will. Those are usually the ones that really, really seem to want to hold tight to the history myths, to believing things at a face value. And, you know, like I said, that isn't all the time, but but it seems to be a lot of the time, at least in my experience. So but as I was saying, usually when there is, I kind of digressed a little bit, but But usually, and I do want to clarify this, because a lot of the time whenever somebody debunks any type of history myth or something that we would call a history myth, there's almost always somebody in the comments in the comment section that, says something to the effect of, well, my cousin's, great, or I don't know, well, my great grandmother's cousin's, brother, that happened to him, or what have you. Say, like, for instance, the death by petticoat myth, the myth where, the myth that says that the #1 death for women, okay, was basically your petticoat catching on fire and you burning to death. Now, that's not to say that it absolutely did not happen, but what Mary Miley Theobald is saying when she gets into that particular history myth was that it wasn't as widespread as people think it was. And that actually was not the #1 death for women in the 18th century. But yes, but what we mean when we're debunking a history myth, if you will, what exactly we mean by that is the fact that there are a couple different kinds of myths, okay? There is the myth where there's a kernel of truth there, all right, but it got embellished, okay, and exaggerated over the years. So that's one kind. Then there's the other kind of history myth where it's kind of like, okay, did that happen? Yes and no. All right. It happened, that might have been a thing, in one group of people, maybe one culture, one religious group, one, region of, England or the new colonies or what have you. So it might have been a thing with one group, but not a thing with another group. So that's kind of like where the yes and no myth comes from. And then there's the myth that, like, is just complete, absolute, just hogwash, and it absolutely didn't happen at all. And for whatever reason, people think it happened, or perhaps, I do know that, a lot of, satire gave birth to a few history myths. For instance, when the British would write, satire about the the colonists back during the American Revolution, or during the 7-Year War or French and Indian War, the English and the French would write, satire, like almost like comic strips about, about each other, about, different prejudices they might have had about each other, or sometimes, they would just completely make things up just because they hated each other. And there's also, many people will tell you that the Victorians actually made a lot of stuff about their Georgian predecessors, their 18th century predecessors, seem way worse than it really was, just because in the 18th century, especially when you're getting more into the mid and later part of it, that was pretty much anything goes, there, and not necessarily in all groups. There were still definitely people who were very pious and God-fearing and religious, but there were also also quite a lot of what people would refer to as debauchery going on in the 18th century. And then when you're getting into the Victorian era, you kind of have where they're trying to rein that in a bit. So what they do is they try to make those that came before them seem really, really bad, and, so sometimes things like that, sometimes that's how a lot of history myths become perceived, especially as those things will become more widespread. So that's usually how a lot of history myths can come to pass. So the two that I am going to discuss tonight, before I get into what I'm going to discuss on my podcast and my music update, are the no ankle history myth, whereas, you know, with women not being allowed to show their ankles, and then women's clothing making them immobile, basically. So, and like I said, just because we might call something a history myth doesn't mean there might be a kernel of truth there, or doesn't necessarily mean that maybe in another time and place, or maybe among another, you know, culture or religious group, that wasn't a thing. But it wasn't a thing all around. And like I said before, one of my biggest pet peeves, as far as, hey Terry, what's up? Good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. One of my biggest pet peeves about about how people often perceive history is that everybody was just this huge hive mind. Nobody had any original thought. Everybody just thought the same. Everybody believed the same beliefs and everything. And that is absolutely not the case at all. People were just as much individuals back then, as far as their thinking goes, back then as there are today. There were different groups, different philosophies, just as much back then as there are today. And that kind of also goes with, as a little side note, one of my other pet peeves is also when people seem to think that Native Americans, are just this, big, ginormous hive mind and culture, when really each tribe has its, they have their own culture, they have their own they have their own languages. If you look at, say, for instance, the East Woodland tribes, here on the East Coast, and then you venture further out to the tribes of the Great Plains and like the Wild West and, and all that, you will see a vast difference, not only in the way they dress themselves, but a lot of their customs, their values, their whole, their moral compasses, their languages, so I kind of wish that things like that would stop. And, because a lot of, and even talking to some other historians, a lot of us really, really hate averages. We really, really hate blanket statements, because and in a way, I think it does way more harm than good. But enough about that. On to the fun stuff. So, yeah. Okay, so myth number 1. All right, colonial women were not allowed to show their ankles, and if they did, they were punished, which included but was not limited to being sent to the pillory. All right, so we're going to be addressing that today. Now, as far as that is concerned, as far as the no ankles thing is concerned, that's one of those kind of yes and no myths, where it definitely it was a thing in some parts, in some time eras. Time eras, I don't know if that's a thing, but in some eras, there were some eras and, time periods where, yes, women did have to, basically be covered from the neck to their ankles, and, sometimes even have their whole heads covered. In fact, and there were even in the 18th century, there were even some religious groups that did, especially, certain cultures that, definitely did stress that and encourage that and sometimes require it. However, to a large degree, and I would even go as far as to say, like, for the most part, skirt length had a lot to do with your station in life. Also how, if whatever occasion you were dressing yourself for. For instance, in the living history world, whenever I get dressed for a living history event, I have skirts of a couple petticoats, if you will, of a couple different size, different lengths. I have a few that is actually comes right above the ankle. And usually that is the most common that you will see in a lot of 18th century dress. And if you're even like, say, you know, a working woman, because yes, women did work back in the day, because that's also a big misconception, was that women weren't allowed to work, period. And that's absolutely not true. Women, they shouldered a lot of the economy, you know, and like I said, you know, husbands and wives, they had their own businesses together. And, you know, whenever, like, say, if for whatever reason the husband was unable to carry on his duties, the business would 9 times out of 10 be passed on to the wife, you know, because a lot of people think, because when I tell that to people, a lot of the times they think, oh, well, I thought it would have been passed on to like the eldest son or whatever. It's like, well, number one, what if the oldest son was 5, you know, are you going to pass on the business to a 5-year-old? And number two, you know, what if it was a family that didn't have any sons? Okay, so, and a lot of the time when a man and a woman got married, the husband back then, when they would marry, they would typically search for somebody within their class, within whatever occupation they were in. So what I mean by that is that, say, a young woman comes from a family of tinsmiths, and she grew up, you know, because the whole family in the 18th century, the whole family would participate in the economy of not only the family, but also basically the community as well. So if a young woman, say, grew up in a family of tinsmiths, and she grew up learning that trade from her mother and father. From her father, she learned how to actually do the hard labor. From the mother, she would learn, like, usually like the bookkeeping, and, you know, because a lot of the women kept the books for the family business. And a lot of the time, you know, the women were, because they knew the business inside and out, even if the husband was the face of it, I've read of several accounts where the women were usually the go-to. So, you know, because they knew the business. But yes, but like, say, a woman like that, she would not be wearing a long skirt to completely cover her ankles and shoes, especially if you're doing a job like tinsmithing, blacksmithing, and I have blacksmithed before, and let me tell you, I would not be able to, you know, properly do the job. I mean, there's no way you can properly do the job safely if you're wearing a floor-length skirt. So a lot of women in those occupations, they would have wear their petticoats to either just above the ankles, or in some cases even, there's even some, you know, some accounts where the woman was actually wearing almost a mid-calf length skirt or a calf length skirt. So it like I said, it depended on what she was doing, her station in life. Now, if you were, say, for instance, a proper lady from a family of, you know, family of wealth, then yes, you very likely would be wearing a floor-length skirt, because, you know, you could, basically. But for your typical middle-class or lower-class working woman, a floor-length skirt just would not have been very practical. And a lot of, contrary to what seems to be very popular belief, a lot of the clothing from the 18th century was actually quite practical. And, you know, whether we're talking clothing for men and women, and, you know, and because that's the thing, and I'll be getting into this other myth in just a minute here, but but I know a lot of the time, and I know every time I'm at an event, if I'm wearing my period clothing, if I had $1 for every time I had somebody come up to me and say, oh, you must be so uncomfortable in that, and I tell them, actually, no, I'm not, and they're usually very shocked. Now, of course, they perceived comfort as a little bit different back then, as opposed to how we perceive comfort. Say for instance, 21st century comfort usually means like t-shirt and leggings or sweatshirt and sweatpants, whereas they had a different perception of wearing comfortable clothes as opposed to what we have today, which I'll be getting into that in a podcast episode. But yes, but it was all about practicality for how they dressed, especially if you were a person that had to work. Now, when you start to get into the more high fashion stuff, that might seem like it's a little bit more restrictive. That was usually seen amongst the upper class, the people that had servants and others to do the work for them, and they could afford to maybe wear something that was a little bit more uncomfortable but looked good. I always tell people every era has its Kardashians. That's absolutely nothing new. So but yes, but the the women weren't allowed to show their ankles. Again, like I said, that's kind of like a yes and no myth. There were, like I said, times in history where women did have to be completely covered, and there were certain cultures, even going forward into time where that was still the norm. But everybody had but kind of like today, everybody had a different perception of what they considered modest or indecent, depending on, like I said, what culture they were from, what religious group they might have been part of. That played a huge role. And not everybody back then was religious either. The American Enlightenment, that movement, that was comprised of people of all different beliefs, of all different walks of life. And it's kind of weird and kind of a little bit strange, because a lot of those people were still God-fearing, but they weren't necessarily religious, so to speak, and they seemed to be open to other ideas as opposed to what the preacher in church might have been saying. So that's definitely an interesting time in history, especially I mentioned her last time, Eliza of Silk and Sass, 1776. That's another great blog to look at. She gets into how cartomancy, or how card reading, or a lot of people would know it as tarot card reading, was actually becoming quite the rage in the 18th century. And then finally in the Victorian era, it was like people were having their card reading parties and everything. But no, it was, and of course, like some, say like a card reader, a woman or a man, because there were also male card readers back then too. Well, they had to be careful of where they went. They had to be careful of how, where they went and just who they were among before they could really proclaim what they did. They had, they wouldn't have been as condemned for it as people thought. And that's another really interesting topic in itself too. And that's why I can't wait to actually start my podcast, so I could really, really delve more into these things. But I'll also leave Eliza's blog post in the link below. So if you want, on cartomancy in the 18th century, if you want to take a peek at it. But that's basically a little debunking of the no ankles myth. Like I said, yes and no. It depends on, when and where we're talking about. And it also but to a large degree, petticoat or skirt length had a lot to do with your station in life, and also, you know, how, you know, if you were going to a formal event, yes, you would wear a longer, more floor-length skirt. If you were working in, you know, working around the house or working with your husband in the blacksmith shop, you would definitely not be wearing a floor-length skirt. And just one more thing that I just thought about before I move on to the next thing. There are actually accounts of some women actually, like, say if they have to get up onto the roof of their house and fix something, because, you know, women did all that stuff. So, hey Christina, card reading in the 18th century, how cool. Yes, yes, definitely. Christina, I will definitely have to point you in Eliza's direction. I think you will appreciate her blog, definitely. So yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really cool to read about that. But yeah, but Christina, I do think you will enjoy Eliza's blog, most definitely. So yeah, but it's like I said, you know, a lot of the myths, a lot of these myths, they're kind of like I said, for those that are just coming in, there seems to be three different kinds. There's, you know, there's kind of like the yes and no, where it depends a great deal. Oh, you're welcome. Where it depends a great deal on, you know, exactly what era we're talking about, what group of people we're talking about, what religious group we're talking about. So it's kind of yes and no. Then there's that myth where there's a kernel of truth that got really, really embellished and blown up over the centuries. And then there's, you know, that occasional one that's just complete and total BS. It's complete and total hogwash. And it probably got started from maybe a satire cartoon, you know, or something like that. I mean, because that does happen too. But yes, so, all right, moving on. So the next one that I'm talking about is, and this is a clothing thing too, and since I do discuss clothing quite a bit, especially in my work in the living history community, is that women's clothing were completely restrictive and made them almost completely immobile. And this kind of goes with the corset, the whole discussions on corsets and stays, which I will be getting into a little bit more in my podcast. And in fact, at the museum that I work at, it's also on August 3rd, it's at the last weekend of August. I'll be with a few good women of the Pittsburgh Historical Costume Society. We'll be talking about the evolution of corsets, because no two corsets or no two pairs of stays are created equal. So yes, so I will be with those awesome women, Sally, Laura, and Kara, discussing some of that. But for now, I will let you in a little bit on how most women's period clothing actually are. I mean, like I said, there are some of the fashions that are a little bit more restrictive, but a lot of the time that was worn by the wealthier, more elite that really didn't have to do too much because they had servants to do things for them. But as far as everyday wear, your typical woman, the thing about clothing and even corsets and stays as well was that they kind of had to be, you know, interchangeable. They kind of had to be adjustable, because when you think about it, women had a lot more kids back then than they do today. So you kind of, your typical, your typical woman is, you almost couldn't, like, it almost really, once again, would not be practical to have completely restricted clothing. And yes, that includes corsets and stays. And if you look at a pair of especially 18th century stays, you will see that it ties not only in the front, but also in the back too. And there's a reason for that. It's so that it could be adjustable, as, you know, a woman might expand a little while she's pregnant and then contract back to pre-pregnancy weight. It's, you know, and then, you know, adjust as she needs to as she, you know, as she goes through changes in life, as she has more children and, you know, loses the pregnancy weight and then, you know, gets pregnant again. You basically, you had to, I mean, women had to have, adjustable clothing, especially when you're talking about how much, you know, how much they had to do back then too. So you wanted your clothing to be as, you know, interchangeable and as adjustable as possible, because even, you know, even the wealthiest people, like most people did not have these extensive wardrobes. A lot of people, they had a few, you know, few good items, because a lot of fabric, you know, you especially if you had to rely on, you know, trade and all that stuff, most people had a few good items that they would wear. They would wear for, you know, different, you know, had, you know, for a few different occasions. But a lot of people, like, they had to, you know, just make sure that, you know, that they're not only their clothing was interchangeable, but also that the quality, you know, the overall quality was good, that they took care of their clothing. And you know, and there's so much that we could get into with how practical that clothing was, you know, everything from the undermost garments, the shifts. And one of these live streams, I'm just gonna bring out some of my petticoats and like just kind of show you just like kind of how things would have worked. But even from the undermost layers, like the shifts, which was, you know, that served as your undergarments, your nightgown, but it also was meant to, like, say, when you're working, trap in a lot of the perspiration so that it wasn't getting out onto your clothes. And they also used very breathable fabrics, like, you know, say linen was very, very popular. And then, you know, in the colder months, you know, of course, they would switch over to wool. But it was, the fact of the matter is that clothing, especially when we're talking about women's clothing, had to be adjustable, just so that, you know, it could adjust along with her as she moved through life. And I think we tend to look at a lot of these satire comics, and like I said, you know, I've heard several people say that a lot of how we perceive history came from people that lived after the era that we're talking about. It's like, say, for instance, the 18th century, the Victorians tended to exaggerate a lot. Then we're getting into the Edwardian era. The Edwardians might have exaggerated a lot about the Victorians and the Georgians and going back. So, and that's why it's really important to, you know, just, like I always say, just question things and don't be afraid to, you know, admit that, hey, you might be wrong. I mean, I might be wrong. You know, I have been wrong about stuff. I mean, there's been times when I'll talk to people in you know, about history, and then, you know, and I'll you know, give them like a certain topic or a certain fact or something that I at least think is fact at that time. And then I do more research and I'm like, oh, okay, so either I was completely off about that, or I was on the right track, but there was just more to it than that. Okay, so those are the two myths that that I'm going to be talking to you about tonight. And I'm thinking, hey, maybe when I do my podcast, I'll add a little myth busting antidote at the end. But yes, the one is the covering of the ankles, which, like for those just joining us, skirt length had a lot to do with, you know, time period, culture. It also had a lot to do with your station in life, whether you were a working woman or whether you were a woman of high class and leisure, or whether, or even if you were, you know, say maybe going to a formal event, you would wear something a little bit longer. If you were working, once again, you would, hey James, what's up? Hope you're doing well. But yes, but you would wear something, you know, a little bit shorter if you were working. Okay, so that's usually how that worked. And as far as women clothing being very restrictive, most women could not really afford to have their clothing be restrictive, just because of all the different cycles they go through in life, you know. And, you know, just the fact alone that women had a lot more children back then than they do today, they kind of had to have, you know, their clothing so that it could be adjustable and, you know, be able to, you know, just adjust their petticoats and even their, you know, their corsets and their, you know, or their stays, you know, when we're talking about 18th century. So, and like I said, I'll be able to delve a lot more into these in the podcast, but that just kind of gives you a little bit, you know, just a little taste of, you know, some of the things that, you know, that I tend to research and also, you know, just and discuss, and the kind of things that inspire me to do the kind of work that I do in music as well as my stories. So, speaking of the podcast, I have with me a little list of some of the topics that I will be discussing. And, you know, so, and these are just going to be, they're going to be their own individual episodes, whereas sometimes on these live streams, I'll just very briefly cover a certain topic or a certain era. But on the podcast, I will be going through some of these topics in a lot more detail. So the premiere episode, which in the next month I'm going to be getting the new format for the podcast together, but the premiere episode is actually going to be inspired by one of my favorite, all-time favorite musicals, Phantom of the Opera, and one of my all-time favorite stories, period. I'm a huge fan of the Gaston Leroux novel. I love the 1925 film with Lon Chaney and Mary Philbin. And then, of course, I love the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, the Yeston Kopit musical as well. So, and then there's been tons and tons of movies. And yes, I actually do like the 2004 version too, with Gerard Butler and Emmy Rossum. You know, that's one of my all-time favorite stories. I absolutely love it. It's another thing that just inspired me so much to do everything that I'm doing. And so it's befitting for me to begin my first episode of the podcast with, you know, with a topic that is inspired by Phantom of the Opera. And it's the title of the podcast is going to be called, What Did Raoul Ever Do to You? So, because people seem to have it out for Raoul, and if you're not familiar with the story, Raoul is the love interest of the opera singer Christine Daae, who is also the obsession of the Phantom, or Eric. And the Phantom, he dwells in the basement of the opera house in Paris, and Christine's kind of like his muse. And he falls in love with her, but of course Christine is in love with Raoul, and you know, and of course, you know, this whole love triangle. It's, I mean, depending on which version of Phantom you see, you know, there's different plays on it, different takes on it. Of course, you know, the Andrew Lloyd Webber version, and then there's the Claude Rains version, where with Claude Rains as the Phantom, and that's kind of an interesting, you know, little spin on it that that they did. I believe that film version was made in 1940s. I could be wrong. but it's another older version. And then there's actually another one from like, I think the 80s with Robert Englund as the Phantom. And then Dario Argento did a version of it. I mean, everybody's doing a version of Phantom. But so yeah, so you'll see different, just different takes on the love triangle. But it just seems like, and I've even noticed this in forums, is like everybody loves to hate Raoul. And I'm like, why? Because, I mean, and I understand, in a way, I think, and even when you're getting into the musical Les Mis, like Les Miserables, everybody loves to hate Cosette because she ends up with Marius, and Eponine is in love with Marius. And I do have to say, when I was in high school and doing musicals and everything, I was totally team Eponine. I absolutely despised Cosette, and I was just, I kind of thought that way too. But then I actually read the Victor Hugo novel, a little bit later, and that's when I started to understand, okay, why, Cosette, why he wrote the character Cosette, because unfortunately in the stage musical, and I love the stage musical, I'm not throwing it any shade or anything, but in the stage musical, Cosette's character is very watered down, and and it's just, and unfortunately you don't really get a chance to see who she is. But in the Victor Hugo novel, she's actually very symbolic of a light, basically a light in the darkness. So when I read the novel later, I was like, oh, okay, I understand that better. And I think with why people tend to favor like the Phantom, and in the Phantom of the Opera love triangle, and Eponine in the Les Mis triangle, is because I think they tend to have like, oh, we have to automatically have to favor the quote-unquote underdog, if you will, and we have to, and I think we are conditioned to also think that, oh, if somebody seems to have it all, like say Raoul, who is like handsome, comes from, has money and all that, and now he also has the Phantom's girl, Christine, and then same thing with Cosette, even though Cosette had a very rough growing up, she was adopted by Jean Valjean, and then, he gave her a very good life. But we're kind of conditioned to believe that we have to really despise somebody like that, when really, that's not the case. See, to me, I think, you can sympathize with the Phantom, you can sympathize with Eponine, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to completely despise like Raoul or Cosette. And I'll delve into that a lot more, just kind of like how as a society we've kind of been conditioned to think that we have to hate people, even hate people almost, like Raoul or Cosette, like the perfect girl or perfect guy or whatever. And just because somebody might seem like they're perfect, doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So that's one. Another one is going to be on, I've said in the past, one of my favorite books is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. And I'm going to discuss that book as well as other old literature about what actually was the inspiration behind such literature. For instance, in Farewell to Arms, especially the main characters, they're based on real life people that Hemingway actually knew. And in fact, the story in itself is kind of autobiographical. He wrote it based off of his experiences in World War I. So, and whenever, it just seems like whenever people read that, that particular story, it seems that, I do wonder if they really understand Hemingway and his life, if they actually took the time to do their due diligence and research his life, research, why he might have written the things that he did, research, you know, why he might have written A Farewell to Arms. What was that, you know, what was that inspiration? Why did he write the characters as he wrote them? You know, who might have inspired that? Because I think a lot of people, and a lot of, you know, reviews and like some criticisms that I've read on it is basically how he wrote Catherine Barkley, the character. And I actually like Catherine, you know, I mean, you know, just sometimes she says some cringe stuff, absolutely, sure. But, you know, but I think a lot of people write that, you know, they were like, oh, you know, he wrote Catherine Barkley because he hated women. And that seems to be a lot of people's go-to argument, if you will. Especially if it's a male writer that's pre-21st century. And I think a lot of people tend to write this stuff, because I've read through the book a few times. And like I said, I'm not going to say that there weren't some little bit of, you know, areas that are a little bit, you know, cringe, but for the most part, I mean, I think it's a great story, you know, and I actually like Catherine's character. And in many ways, I actually think she's a pretty strong character. I mean, she's a nurse in, you know, World War I. I mean, you couldn't be weak and be an army nurse. I mean, especially back then, you just couldn't. And there's other reasons why I actually think she's a good character, but I get a little irritated when I see some of these writers from the past just get raked over coals because what they write might not completely match up with, say, morals of today. But it's just kind of like, well, number one, you kind of have to look at the context, you know, like what time you have to take that into consideration, like the context it was written in. And number two, once again, maybe assume you're wrong, you know, do your research, you know, just research why he might have written, you know, the characters as he did, you know. So, you know, so that's another thing that I will be discussing. I am also going to be discussing, get ready for it, the male suffragists, because you really don't hear too much of that. There were, back, you know, in the day when women were fighting for the right to vote, there were a lot of men behind that too. A lot of men that were actually quite supportive of that. And you really don't hear that. And the narrative that, you know, anytime somebody brings that up, you know, whether I see it in a discussion forum or whether I see it just randomly online, it's like the way it's usually, I've seen it talked about, at least, it's that every man, every last one of them was just trying to stifle women's like voice and everything. And that's not the case. I mean, there were a lot of great men, Frederick Douglass, James Mott, and even Thomas Paine, way back in the 18th century. Thomas Paine, who's best known for his pamphlet, Common Sense, he actually was a huge, yay, male suffragist. Yes, Christina. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, Thomas Paine. I mean, like I said, he's best known for his pamphlet Common Sense, which was passed around during the American Revolution. But he also wrote an essay. He was actually a huge proponent of women's rights. And he actually wrote an essay, and I have it written down because I want to look it up too, called A Letter on the Female Sex. And he was very much for, you know, women, you know, having a voice and, you know, having rights and everything. And like I said, Frederick Douglass, James Mott, and even, well, Susan B. Anthony, I was doing some reading on her, and she actually got a lot of her inspiration from her father. Her father was very much for, you know, for women having a voice and women's rights and everything. And he was a school teacher, and he opened up a school, and I do believe a young Susan went to this school. He opened up a school specifically for boys and girls learning together and learning, you know, but all learning the same subjects and learning equally. So she got a lot of her ideas actually from her father, which I thought was pretty cool too. But I'm really excited about that podcast and, you know, getting into that. So yeah, because like I said, you don't really hear too much of that. I mean, even though I've seen some photos and videos of, the women suffragists like marching, and I have seen some footage of, men marching with them, or men standing at the side and like, cheering and everything. And, so I think that, like I said, I'm for looking at the larger picture. I don't really like this compartmentalization that seems to happen. So, so that's kind of what I'm, kind of looking to do with some of this stuff, is just, and that's what I aim to do all the time, is to give people a larger picture on what's going on. And then, of course, I'm also going to be doing a full podcast episode on corsets. And also I'll be delving into some mysteries of the ancient world, the Celts, the Norse, and the Egyptians. So I'm really, because I love ancient history as well, very ancient history. I like exploring just those, just kind of like that information that it just seems lost, to time. And, and just exploring like the different theories, the different findings and everything. So that's a little bit of what you're going to see on the podcast, and I'm going to be launching that within the next month. And that's going to accompany my Inside the Labyrinth blog and my little online TV show that I sometimes do, when I interview people at the different history events. So, and last but not least, here is a musical update. A couple of our events are being rescheduled. We did have some, the gigs that I had with the early music group, Wayward Companions, as well as some of my gigs with the Historical Music Society Orchestra. A lot of those got postponed due to everything that was going on. But there are a couple that are being rescheduled. And we were recently asked to play at a couple events in the fall. And they're not completely finalized yet, so I'm not going to announce them just yet, but stay tuned for that. And I'm also making more progress on my own new music. I'm making more progress on my versions of Health to the Company, John Barley, Corn Must Die. I am also choosing a few more traditional songs that I'm going to be doing, old traditional songs, and writing some originals as well. So it's going to be Celtic rock, dark Celtic rock. So if you enjoy old world instruments combined together with, your typical electric guitar, drums, things like that, I think you'll definitely enjoy it. It'll be in the same vein of like some of the stuff I've done before, but of course you always want to keep experimenting and do things a little bit different and all that stuff. And, so I'm making progress on that. And actually, I think my version of Health to the Company, it's getting pretty close to being able to maybe have me do a kind of like a little keyboard and voice performance on one of these live streams. It's getting close to that. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting close, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating with a bunch of musicians. And I'm planning on releasing an actual new full-length album sometime like probably spring, summer of next year. So that's what I've been working on. I do want to do at least, my original plan was to do also a Christmas, like a holiday, an old world holiday EP for this year's holiday season. Not sure if I'll be able to release a full EP, but I'd at least try to do like release a single or something like that. So so I'll definitely be updating you on that as well. And yeah, and what else? And is there anything else? Yeah, I think that's all for this one. I'm actually, oh yes, I am going to be doing 2 bonus live streams this weekend too. So one tomorrow before I take I film my new episode of Dark Side of the Labyrinth, which covers the darker side of history, the more paranormal and haunted side of history. And I'll even get into stuff like, you know, the fairy realms and all that stuff. So that's what Dark Side of the Labyrinth covers. The way I air that is it first airs on my Patreon first. So those on my Patreon get to see it first. And a week later, it's available to everybody else. So yeah, so I'm really excited about this one because it's inspired by fairy tales and the Brothers Grimm. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. But I'll be doing a bonus live stream right before that. And then on Sunday, I will do another one. It'll be an unboxing of Mythology candles. They're a very cool non-toxic candle company that basically their product is inspired by basically by history and mythology. So yeah, so I'm really excited to do that unboxing as well. So yeah, so those all be 2 bonus surprise ones. And then on June 28th, my friend Chuck Alston and I were going to be doing a living room music session. We're going to be performing 2 songs, and that's going to be happening on June 28th on a Sunday. That's going to be another bonus live stream. So yeah, hope you'll join us for that. And yes, hope you guys enjoyed this live stream. I want to thank everybody that's been tuning in. Need to get you on the Dead stream again soon. Yes, James, I would love to come back on again. That was so much fun. Yes, I would love to come back on the Dead stream again. So, and Terry, love the Brothers Grimm. Me too. I absolutely adore the Brothers Grimm. I love their stories, and I love how I love the original fairy tales too. And a lot of people are often surprised when they hear that the original fairy tales were actually written for adults, more as kind of cautionary tales. But then of course they became Disneyized over the years. But I'm going to be getting into a little bit of that in Dark Side of the Labyrinth, and I'm, you know, super excited about that. And I'm super excited about the look that I'm going to be donning for that too. Possible Snow White, I don't know, we'll see. But yes, but does anybody else have any comments or questions for me? All right, well, thank you very much, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to bringing you more. And like I said, for those of you that came in a little bit late at the beginning, my live streams, instead of being at 7 p.m. like they have been, they're going to be at 7:30 instead for the foreseeable future. And that has a lot to do with the fact that I had a slight change in my schedule due to more things being open now. And hey, Christina, yes, it's been fun. Thank you so much for coming, Christina. Awesome. Yes. But there was a change in my schedule, and so now it has to be at 7:30, and that's due to the fact that more things are being open, including gyms, and I'm also a fitness trainer, and so we are open again, but of course, you know, we're treading lightly right now. Our hours are a little bit different than they normally are. So, so for right now, I'm going to be doing them at 7:30 instead of 7. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for commenting, and you know, it's always appreciated. I always love hanging out with you guys. All right, and hope you have a lovely evening. Take one more swig of tea. All right, cheers. All right, And I will hopefully see you guys next Friday, or hey, maybe even at my 2 bonus ones this weekend. So, all right, talk to you guys later. All right, turn this off without spilling the tea. All right, have a good weekend. Ah.